Yo, what's good, Spirit Squad? Today we're going to be super hyped to talk about some Pioneer, and the reason we're going to be so excited about it is because, well, we're always excited about Pioneer. But that aside, we finally got announcements for organized play that we're going to have the Pro Tour back. That means we're going to have a lot of high-level IRL Magic, and that is a great excuse to get into a format that's being highlighted on this kind of level for the first time. We have had some Magic Online tournaments here and there for Pioneer, but you know, nothing super huge, nothing super exciting outside of a couple of Magic Online things here and there. But now we're finally going to be getting super big prize Pioneer play. And I thought that, you know, as a proponent of one of Pioneer's most popular decks, I'm in a pretty good position to let you guys know exactly what's what as far as the format's concerned. So today we're going to do a Pioneer deck tier list. A tier list, for anybody who doesn't know, is simply taking the decks, ordering them, and then seeing exactly how we think they stack up against each other. We'll go over the tier list format in a quick second, and after that, we'll jump right into the decks so that we can see what's what. So for anybody who's unfamiliar with tier lists, we'll see that these are going to be ranked from S all the way down to D. We've got S is for Spirits because Spirits is always the best deck. It's not the best deck, but we like it the most, so it goes on top. A is going to be for a pretty viable deck. B tier, you know, middle of the road. B's pretty boring. We have the B tier. C is for choice because by playing these decks, you are making a choice. And D is for don't buy this. Probably. These are going to be the decks where, honestly, they don't really stack up too well against the rest of the decks, but if you're an expert at that deck, you can still get results. Now that we know exactly how the tier list works, let's jump right into our first deck. So the first deck we're going to talk about is going to be my personal favorite, Bant Spirits. Spirits is in a relatively unique spot in the meta in that it's got a great matchup against any deck that is trying to use the stack to resolve spells that cost more than 2. It's really good against blue-white control, it's great against the combo decks, and it's pretty good against any of the Izzet piles of removal plus bring to light. That puts us in a really great spot because we do get to play even more counter spells than the actual control decks against those decks. However, that does put us in a place of being relatively weak against the really aggressive decks like mono red and like humans. So you have a bit of a decision to make on which decks you want to beat if you're playing Spirits. The mix-up of good matchups versus unreasonable matchups, I believe puts us in a pretty good place when compared to the meta, but ultimately we're in this slightly positive end of the middle. That means that we're going to be somewhere right around the top of B or the bottom of A tier, and I believe for us that means I would put Bant Spirits at the top of B tier. So we're going to start off with our tier list looking like this. So next up is going to be Burn. I think Burn's actually in a pretty decent place right now. So Burn gets to be hyper-focused in an area where people are still trying to figure out lists, and where if a format is getting popular, that means that it's not solved. That's a great place for Burn to be because you're just doing one thing, right? You're burninating your opponents, you're pointing spells at their face, you're pointing creatures at their face, and a lot of these decks really just won't have the time to cobble together piece 1 plus piece 2. The other good part about Burn is that Eidolon and a Great Revel does a lot of really great work against a lot of these combo decks that are running around. So if you're finding things like Lotus field decks, if you're finding things like Jeskai Ascendancy decks, and to some extent even decks like Spirits that are looking to cobble together the right section of spells in their deck to combat what you're doing, well, if you catch that person slipping and they get the wrong half of the deck, they're dead. And that's a really great spot for a deck like Burn to be, so I think that Burn should actually be somewhere right in our A tier. That means that we're going to update our list to look just like this. Yo, so next up we're going to talk about the Greasefang decks. And for anybody who's not aware of this, the idea is that you take Greasefang, you put Greasefang on a table, and at the start of combat it can reanimate a vehicle that's in your graveyard. The vehicle of choice is going to be a Parhelion 2. When you attack with Parhelion 2, you get a couple of 4/4 tokens that stick around even when Parhelion leaves the table. Since you're going to be attacking with Parhelion for 5 and 2 angel tokens for 4 apiece, that's 13 damage, and the 8 damage from the tokens left over means that you've just got lethal all in one go, right? So there's your army and a cannon. That's how this deck works. The problem with the Greasefang deck right now is that, well, it uses both the graveyard and the stack to do something important. That means that a lot of decks can interact with this right now, especially since Arclight Phoenix exists. That means that people are already targeting the graveyard. You're not really going to get to revive Parhelion as much as you would like to. It also happens to lose on the stack, which is just not a great place to be. Like, if you're playing against something like Spirits, resolving a Greasefang is a challenge. If you're playing against Blue-White Control, they have both counterspells and Rest in Peace. Shoulder shrug. And too many other decks have good removal, and they can just kill Greasefang before you exit your first main phase, making its ability completely irrelevant. Unfortunately for poor Greasefang, that means that this is going to be our first D tier deck. Next up is going to be Auras, and there's a bunch of different versions of Auras, but I honestly think this deck was really hurt by the loss of Lurrus. So the idea here is that you're playing a deck that's a lot like Bogles in Pauper or Modern, where you're just taking a creature, you're taking a bunch of auras, and you're making its power and toughness completely unreasonable in only a couple of turns. That's really sweet, and the addition of Lightpaw's Emperor's Voice was really big for this archetype. Losing Lurrus did suck, but you got a really cool new toy at the same time. I've even seen some Twitter screenshots of like turn 3 Lightpaws attacking for 20 something damage. Like, it's really cool. I think that Auras is not in the best place right now though. It is a powerful hyper-focused deck, and I think that's a great place to be. However, I think the removal in Pioneer is so good right now that just getting to the point of untapping with your 2/2 that doesn't really get to protect itself too much is not a reasonable ask right now. You can do some really great work against things like these combo decks, right? Where you're just gonna go ahead, play a Lightpaws, play a Saram Edificer, you can play just Deafening Silence, Archon of Emeria, things that are already in white to try to slow these decks down, but then you're slowing your own deck down. It's a weird place to be, and I don't know that Auras is exactly the best deck to be playing in the face of all the removal that exists in Pioneer right now. But it still is powerful and hyper-focused, and I do like that. So I won't put it in D tier, but I do think that Auras is currently a C tier deck. Next up is going to be our first unreasonably good deck, and that's going to be Winota Combo. So the idea here is that you play a bunch of humans and non-humans. The non-humans are going to be the lower end of your curve until you actually get up to casting Winota, and you get to cast her really early thanks to cards like Elvish Mystic, whatever other Elvish Mystic is, Llanowar Elves, and Prosperous Innkeeper. And you play those so that you can play an early turn 3 Winota, you attack with some of your other non-human creatures, and her ability will trigger and take humans off the top of your deck. So you get to play things like Angrath Marauders for double damage, Blade Historian so that all your creatures have double strike, Kenrith so that you can basically do whatever the hell you want with your mana, and there's just a lot of very good choices. The addition of Brutal Cathar means that this deck got to just play a removal spell that's a creature, and also Winota's ability can roll you into a removal spell. It's a really powerful deck, and honestly it's super obnoxious, especially once these people figured out to put in Selfless Spirit into their deck. Anyway, so yeah, Winota is a very good deck, and I think it is going to take a couple of L's in the next couple of weeks because red-black midrange is really popular, and all of that removal does say bad things from Winota, but she still does great against just about every other deck in the format, so I think that still makes her a really solid S tier deck choice. So our next deck is going to be humans. Now, there's a few different versions of humans. I like the one that plays 5 colors and Collected Company the best, because that one's going to have the most game against all of your removal pile decks by virtue of just having Collected Company in your deck. I think that's the best one of the bunch. With that said, it is also very cool that humans finally got access to Thalia Gardening of Thraben. Anybody who's watched my modern videos knows that I absolutely love Thalia. That's my girl, that's my boo, I love her to death. And the fact that humans in Pioneer finally gets to play this card means that you actually have some real game against things like Control, against things like Combo, and even a little bit of game against decks like Mono Red. That's a big deal. With that said, I do still think that this deck loses really hard to removal piles. Like, it's going to lose to red-black, it's going to lose to things like Izzet Phoenix, and unfortunately you don't really get much say-so. And this isn't modern. That means you don't get Noble Hierarch, you don't get Aether Vial, and if you're falling behind to these removal piles, you are also guaranteeing that you don't really have a way to get ahead, which kind of stinks for this archetype because I do like it. Unlike spirits, you don't have cards like Rattle Chains to protect yourself from the removal spells, which means that life just gets worse and worse the more removal your opponents draw. So anytime you fight a control deck, unfortunately, it's just a handshake. For that reason, I think that Humans is going to end up sitting at a C tier, although I do wish it would be better. So next up on our little chopping block is going to be Jeskai Ascendancy Combo. So for anybody who hasn't seen this before, the way it works is that you play Jeskai Ascendancy, and with a bunch of lands on the table, you resolve Sylvan Awakening. Sylvan Awakening is a 3-drop sorcery that gives all of your lands 2/2s, but also they have haste, reach, and indestructible. The indestructible is one of the most important parts, and as a spirits player, I really hate the reach. Anyway, with Sylvan Awakening resolved, all your lands are now creatures, so any number of non-creature spells that you play will untap mana every time you do this. So with the Jeskai Ascendancy on the table, you float a bunch of mana with your lands, you cast something low cost like an Opt or a 1-cost Treasure Cruise, you untap all of your lands, now they're bigger, you rinse and repeat because you're drawing spells each time. So you draw cards like Opt, Expressive Iteration, Treasure Cruise, Consider, and you keep doing this until you're able to continue to loop spells. Each time you cast something, your creatures are all getting bigger, so your indestructible land haste creatures are all getting bigger, and eventually you'll just attack your opponent for 100 million and they just die. That's the idea behind the Jeskai Ascendancy combo deck. Unfortunately for this deck, I think it's in a really rough place right now, for a few reasons. First of all, Jeskai Ascendancy has to resolve. Pioneer is a very blue format, and Mystical Dispute is probably the most played counterspell in the entire format. The fact that Mystical Dispute hits your key combo piece makes it really rough for you to excuse playing this. Of course you are playing your own disputes, but that's not really a fight you want to fight when your job is to resolve something that costs 3 at sorcery speed. The second reason I don't really like this deck right now is because it exists in the same format as Lotus Field Combo, which means people are already gunning for a spell-based combo deck. And if they're gunning for a spell-based combo deck, then I don't know that you want to be a spell-based combo deck that is not as strong as the Lotus Field Combo, in my opinion. It's a great deck, I think it's very cool, and it is powerful, but I think it's a little misplaced in the meta right now. And unfortunately that means that I think we have another C-tier deck on our hands in Jeskai Ascendancy. You know what, let's actually talk about Lotus Field Combo now while we're thinking about it, right? So Lotus Field Combo, I think, is one of the best decks in the entire Pioneer format. It's really good. And if you want to see some dedicated content, one of my boys happens to be Brian Cook, so check him out at the Epic Storm. Anyway, I think Lotus Field Combo is just really good as far as combo decks concerned. It does have a few natural predators, but so does every deck in this format. Eidolon Great Revel sucks, you're a combo deck. There's really no ifs, ands, or buts about saying that. Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, now that she's actually in the format, she also sucks, but less so. And honestly, your Spirits matchup is kind of abysmal. But other than those few things, Lotus Field beats up on a lot of the format. It does great against Winota, it does better against Phoenix, and most of the mid-rangey decks just don't present a clock that is anywhere near reasonable against Lotus Field. Even Thoughtseize backed up by like 2 or 3 power at a time is not enough to stop this deck from doing its thing. For that reason, I think Lotus Field Combo is going to be another one of our S tier decks. Next up, we get to talk about one of my absolute favorite decks, and that's going to be Mono Blue Spirits with Curious Obsession. So Mono Blue Spirits is a very polarizing deck. You either have great matchups or abysmal matchups against almost everything. Right now, I think the really good matchups for this are going to be a lot of decks that use the stack. So things like Lotus Combo, things like Jeskai Ascendancy, things like Blue-White Control. Spirits is pretty good against all of those things. Spirits is not so good against the decks that either have like 5 million points of removal or are super low to the ground. Decks like Mono Red are your actual worst nightmare because that's both. You also don't necessarily enjoy seeing the red-black decks, but you can beat them. However, I think there's a lot of removal piles in the format right now. Izzet Phoenix, while it is a reasonable matchup, plays a ton of removal, especially in games 2 and 3, and it makes it really hard for you to be able to connect with your namesake card, Curious Obsession. You also just have a pretty hard time against things like Supreme Verdict, since the mono blue version of this deck doesn't get to play cool cards like Selfless Spirit. You don't even get to play Valorous Stance, which I actually am playing 2 of in blue-white. But with that said, I think that Spirits is not necessarily in the best place for the mono blue version. If you're playing blue-white or Bant, where you have access to more sideboard things, your deck does get a lot better. But mono blue, I think that one's going to be another C tier deck, even if I really love it. So next we get to talk about kind of the new kid on the block, and that's going to be Oni Cult Anvil Sacrifice. This deck is really sick. You get to do a lot of the really annoying stuff that decks were already doing in decks like Jund Sacrifice. So you get to play Cat plus Oven combo, you get to play the new experimental synthesizer, which can be sacrificed to things like Deadly Dispute, and of course our namesake card here, Oni Cult Anvil. So this thing can sacrifice an artifact, you get a 1/1, and you get to drain and gain, and you get to rinse and repeat that effect every turn. So you sacrifice your experimental synthesizer and you get to effectively just draw an extra card every time you do that. You get to play with Witch's Oven plus Cat, and you can sacrifice food tokens to make 1/1s, or you can sacrifice food tokens to reanimate your cat. It's really sick. You get to play my absolute least favorite card in this entire format, Mayhem Devil. So if anybody sees a Mayhem Devil out in public, know that I said your mother. And it also combines really nicely with the Meathook Massacre, which already is a card that you might want to play in a lot of creature matchups, right? Like say you're playing against spirits or against mono red, you know, killing creatures plus being able to drain and gain life is a great boon to have. When you combine that with things like Cat Oven, your deck gets really annoying really quickly. And thanks to cards like Experimental Synthesizer and Deadly Dispute, this deck never runs out of cards. You just always have like 4 cards in hand. It's so annoying. Anyway, I think this deck's really good, and I think it only stands to be able to get better. Like the more people play with this deck, they'll figure out cards to put in it. And until then, I think this is a really, really solid A tier choice. Man, here we go. This is the Fun Police. Nobody likes to be on the other end of blue-white control. It's definitely the Fun Police. This is just the same as it is in every other format, right? Like you play some version of Teferi, you play some Supreme Verdicts, your opponent gets really miserable and sad, and you eventually take over the game with whatever win condition you choose. A lot of these decks are playing Shark Typhoon. You can choose other stuff too if you really want to. I've even seen Hullbreaker Horror in a list before, or Hull Breacher Horror, whatever the 7/8 is. It's, I don't know, it's standard legal. But yeah, blue-white's really good. That's it. It's a great deck. It's S tier. I don't really need to kind of BS around with y'all for that one. It's just one of the best decks in the format. It has great matchups all around. And the card Absorb makes this low-key really, really good against the aggressive decks, which other versions of Control just don't have access to. So yeah, S tier. Next deck. Yo, so next up is going to be our Niv to Light piles, and these are going to be the decks that play both Bring to Light and Niv Mizzet Reborn, so that you have your giant 5-color control deck that's playing huge piles of removal, occasional cards like Thoughtseize and Thought Erasure to help your blue-white matchup, and then you just resolve big giant threats and, well, your opponent gets dead. That's basically how this deck works. The problem with Niv to Light, I think, is that a lot of the removal is just way too expensive to solve the problems that Pioneer is currently presenting. So if you're trying to play against Aurus, for example, that deck plays a 4x Karametra's Blessing, which protects against, well, really any removal. It makes your creature indestructible, and generally your opponent gets really sad. Your removal in the Niv decks, outside of exactly Fatal Push, are all guaranteed to cost at least 2 mana. And when you're paying 2+ mana to solve a 1 mana problem, you know, unfortunately, it's kind of like bringing a knife to a gunfight, and I think that's what the Niv Mizzet decks are doing. With that said, sometimes you can just beat up on creature decks by virtue of having a million points of removal in your deck. That will just happen sometimes. So you're still going to get some wins, just not all of the wins like this deck used to. With that said, I think Niv to Light is pretty solidly a B tier choice right now. Yo, so now we get Jund Sacrifice, and this is going to be kind of your classic old school Jund deck that plays Korvold, it plays Trail of Crumbs, all of this cool green stuff, so that your deck can be, well, 3 colors, cool, do a bunch of things, and Korvold is a pretty great payoff. But if I'm being completely honest, this deck walked so that only Cult could run. That's kind of where we are right now. And the 3rd color really does hurt you against a lot of the aggressive decks too, which kind of stinks, right? Like against mono red, you can't afford the extra shock lands required to play green, and you can't really afford to take a turn off to play a card like Trail of Crumbs. And that matters kind of a lot. Like either way, you're going to get the card advantage that you need to beat up on decks like blue-white, because you're always going to presenting permanents, you're always going to have things like Cat Oven, so you're always going to have some kind of damage, some kind of clock, some kind of reach. So this deck is still very good at doing exactly that thing, but overall, you don't really have as much early card advantage as the red-black deck does, and by having a 3rd color in your deck, your mana is much worse. Like you don't get to play anywhere near as many creature lands as the red-black deck does. You don't have to worry so much in the red-black deck about taking damage from your lands as much as you do in a Jund deck. Just overall, honestly, not a great place to be in life, which I like this deck, but I do think I have to rate it all the way down to C tier, where Oni Call Anvil is an A right now. Yo, so next up is going to be Mono Black Aggro, which is a deck that's actually been seeing a little bit of play again, which, I don't know, I think it's kind of cool. So this deck has the advantage of being able to play a lot of cards out of the graveyard, like it's 1 and 2 drops, whereas other aggressive decks, if you kill the creatures, they just kind of stay dead. Mono Black doesn't really do that whole staying dead thing. So that's the reason that you would generally want to play a deck like Mono Black. You also get to play Thoughtseize alongside your aggro plan, which is pretty good against control decks, and it's especially good against combo decks. With that said, I think the control decks and the combo decks right now are a little bit too resilient for just like a Thoughtseize or a Duress to really get the job done, even post board. Instead, you just get to, you know, have, say, Lotus Field. They're just gonna draw another copy of like Pour Over the Pages or Wish or something to just get you dead, and one Thoughtseize is just really undone by any card in their deck almost, and it kind of stinks. Jeskai Ascendancy, a Thoughtseize against that deck unless you actually hit the Ascendancy is borderline laughable. And even Blue-White Control gets to play a bunch of sweepers now, like they have access to a bunch of good spot removal finally in the Azorius Charm, the March of Otherworldly Light. They get to play Seal Away. There's a lot of things to make sure that your creatures don't actually connect, and post board they get to play additional sweepers like Settle the Wreckage and stuff if they really want to. So just, you know, not a really great time for you to be a Thoughtseize pilot. There's not really a great spot for this deck because you have a lot of the downsides of playing one color where you just don't get a lot of sideboard options, and unfortunately the one upside you get, Thoughtseize, is overshadowed by a few other decks. Like you can, if you wanted to play Thoughtseize in aggressive style, you can just play Vampires. Then you get to have the additional color in white if you want to play good white sideboard cards like Rest in Peace. You can play the same Thoughtseize Inquisition, Duress. Inquisition is not in this format, y'all. You can play the same Thoughtseize Duress plan with Fatal Push that you can play in Mono Black. You can play a bunch of creatures with Lifelink in the Vampire Shell. You get to play probably the best Planeswalker in the entire format in 3-drop Sorin. So why would you play this deck? And my advice to you, I wouldn't. I would place this right in the D tier. And we actually will talk about Vampires now. So Vampires, unlike Mono Black, I think is actually in a pretty reasonable spot. So all of the stuff that we said before, right? You get to play Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Duress out of the sideboard if you really want to go deep on a discard, but you also get to play just really solid cards that are great on their own, right? Like you get to play Sorin Imperious Bloodlord, which I guess defeats the purpose of saying plays well on its own because it needs vampires to be good, but it makes all of your vampires actually insane. Like the lifelink that you get is crazy. You get to use its other +1 to provide lightning helixes so you can just like burn out opponents that are making your attacks unreasonable. You get to play early copies of Champion of Dusk with your -3 so you can just draw a bunch of cards if need be. There's a lot of really great things that this deck does. You're also a 2-color deck because you are splashing white for Edgar Charmed Groom, so you can play cards like Rest in Peace, Deafening Silence, Archon of Emeria, all of these cool, good white cards that shut down a lot of the decks that creature decks are naturally weak against. So you get to kind of shore up your bad matchups with a bunch of white cards out of the board, and that's a good enough plan. Also, just, again, the lifelink, I can't really stress that enough because it makes your matchup against aggressive decks so good. Like a Resolved Sorin is basically a handshake against mono red, it's a handshake against spirits. Sometimes it's good enough against decks like auras that you can just sometimes race with your Death Touchers and Lifelinkers. Vampires, I think, is going to be a really solid B tier choice because it is that much better than the mono black aggressive deck. So B tier it is. Honestly, I'm a little surprised I avoided talking about this deck for so long. So this is going to be Arclight Phoenix, and Arclight Phoenix is definitely one of the best decks in the entire format. I think that this deck is very easy to target, but at the same time, powerful enough to the point that it just doesn't care half the time. And I think right now people are finally starting to adjust to just like the Phoenix and the Thing in the Ice plans that this deck presents, but both of those are just really good solid plans, right? I think that this deck used to be solidly S tier, probably one of the top 2 decks in the format, but now there's a lot of people figuring out exactly which removal cards they want to pack in their decks, which cards are best at solving Arclight Phoenix and Thing in the Ice themselves, and they're applying those, and they're playing things like red-black mid-range that can just shut this deck down entirely, and that deck's really popular. You also just have like the upside of just infinite card draw, right? Like you get to play Explosive Iteration, you get to play Treasure Cruise, Galvanic Iteration can copy either of those spells basically whenever you feel like it in the later game, and you're just never gonna run out of cards, right? You even get to play copies of Temporal Trespass, which is a time walk, you take an extra turn, and when you copy something like that with Galvanic Iteration, well, you know, the world's your oyster. You just get to basically play like a combo deck and your life is really sweet. So I think this deck, even with a bunch of people playing targeted removal and graveyard hate, is still A tier even with all of that hate. I think that this deck is so good that even though people are playing cards like Graveyard Trespasser in the main to hate on graveyards, I still think this deck is super playable and it's worth your time. Like if you can afford to buy another deck, I'd probably suggest buying this deck because it just will not die. So A tier it is, even with all the targeted hate. Hey, so best for last, we've got another one of the cool new kid decks. And by cool new kid, I really mean the most boomer fucking deck you could possibly imagine. Red-black midrange for Pioneer is literally just Jund for Modern, except this deck is actually good. So you can play this deck in Pioneer and it's got a lot of very good to reasonable matchups. You get to play the best removal in the format since you're black and red. You also get to play all of the good discards since you're playing black anyway. And some great cool new kid creatures. You get to play this thing, Graveyard Trespasser, and it's really good on multiple fronts, right? Like 3 mana for a 3/3, honestly not that impressive. But when you add in the fact that it both hates on graveyards and does the draining game thing at the same time, now you've got a great matchup against a whole bunch of decks. It helps a little against mono red, it helps a lot against decks like Izzet Phoenix that are trying to have both Treasure Cruise and Arclight Phoenix in the graveyard. You get to help against other Treasure Cruise decks like Jeskai Ascendancy just by virtue of having this card resolve, like that's already good enough. And then you get to play some reasonable planeswalkers, like you get to play Chandra Torch of Defiance, you get to play Sorin the Mirthless, and now you've got card advantage in your red-black deck. It's just a solid good deck. Like, this is not a deck that you're embarrassed to play. And with that said, I think red-black midrange is actually a solid A-tier choice right now. If you want to play a deck that gives you a 50-50 chance against the field, I'm going to say this is it. So now that we've gone over what each of the decks looks like, what their function within the meta is, this is going to be my finalized version of the tier list for now. Right now, I think the best decks are going to be the Winotas, the Lotus Fields, and the blue-white controls of the format. I think those are going to be the decks to beat, and the A tier is all bangers. These are all decks that you should look out for. So do not undervalue Burn, do not undervalue the red-black Sacrifice deck. Definitely do not undervalue Arclight Phoenix. The only reason I'm putting Arclight Phoenix in the A tier is because there is already a ton of targeted hate for that deck, and it is still good enough to be in the A tier. If people were not actively going out of their way to hate on Arclight Phoenix, it would probably be the best S tier deck right now. Red-black mid-range, not to be underestimated. It attacks you on all fronts with discard and removal, and every single one of the threats it plays can win the game on its own. Do not undervalue this deck. But all the other decks that you're looking at right here are reasonably powerful, good choices to play that you can totally win tournaments with. Like, I don't know, I beat up on people with Spirits all the time, and the best version of Spirits right now I put as B tier. So if you have a favorite deck, this is not saying that you can't play your favorite deck. Just be aware of what you're going to see other people playing. That's all. But that's going to be our tier list, and let me know exactly what you're thinking about the tier list, about what you want to play in Pioneer, and on how you think the addition of Pro Play is going to affect the format as a whole. But that's enough talking for me. It's kind of been a while. So if you like what you're watching, make sure to click like on this video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and I'll see y'all in the next one.